Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorten. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, it looks like it's gone beyond the beginning of the end for the Ukraine conflict, but perhaps more, we're into the seventh, eighth inning, and we're starting to see some of the outlines of what the future after the conflict ends is going to be for not just Russia, the West, NATO, the US, and the like. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being part of this great discussion. And want to get your thoughts on some of the updates regarding the Kursk and Donetsk region part of the war.
Yeah, we don't focus a lot on this, as I've said. Repeating what 50 other channels are claiming is really of no value. So I think when there are some strategic milestones, which is an awful word to use, but you get my point, then it's worth discussing. Now, with regards to Kursk, it's absolute farce from the Ukrainian perspective, because they went in thinking, as you said in a previous podcast, they could use it as a bargaining chip. Somehow they could force Russia out of areas in like Zaporozhye or Kherson in exchange for giving Russia its territory back. Well, the Kursk offensive is a complete failure, but if they were to leave in totality, it is such a horrendous policy failure that the feeling is, well, we just have to keep sending military personnel into Ukraine, even though they're all being killed almost within a matter of hours, maybe a day at the most. I think now there's about 20,000 Ukrainians who've died. Can't estimate how many have been injured. Maybe at least that many injured, maybe more. And Russia has regained most of the territory, and there's just a small amount of land across the border, which Ukraine claims they're still in Kursk, therefore, they're achieving their objectives, but it's an absolute disaster. And from a PR perspective, and it's not a nice word to use in the context of a war, it's an absolute unmitigated 100% failure and disaster, and there's no other word to describe it. With regards to Donetsk, today Russia took Ugledar, which is a key strategic town. They're making rapid progress in the last 2 or 3 months. And because there's literally no Ukrainian resistance anymore, because they've moved huge amounts of their forces into Kursk in Russia, and also just because of the casualty rates, and also there's a lack of weapons and all the resources they need to fight the war. So in essence, this is turning into an absolute devastating end to the war, however long this goes on for. And it's debatable, because as much as any, the US is now shipping arms that would have gone to Ukraine to Israel now. So how much longer the war goes on for is debatable. But Zelensky, of course, went to the US. The whole trip was a complete disaster. It was a disaster for the Biden administration, and his victory plan was, to put it diplomatically, a farce. It was completely ridiculed, and it was just absolutely pointless. And there was no merit to it whatsoever. No one takes it seriously. Now, interestingly, is the point, why is Scholz so desperate to talk to Putin? Well, clearly it's because they know the war's over. Clearly, the argument from Germany's perspective is, well, we're going to need Russian energy in the future. Germany's collapsing. It's deindustrializing rapidly. It's falling apart. It's no longer wants anything to do with the Ukraine war. It's made its position very clear. You're not having Taurus missiles, and therefore you can't fire them into Russia. But the Russian perspective is, why are we going to talk to you? You're just a Washington stooge. And bearing in mind, you've supported Ukraine, so you're an enemy. We don't have discussions with enemies. There is no value to this discussion, because we could reach, for argument's sake, they could reach an agreement and immediately it'll be torn to pieces. An agreement mean how they could work with Germany going forward, for argument's sake, because it's not going to happen. But if it did, it's not worth the time and effort. So these kind of discussions, and if Macron, the Russians are not prepared to discuss anything with him ever again, because Putin and Macron had a private discussion, and it got leaked to the Western media. And after that, Russia said, we can't trust you. We're never speaking to you again. So at the moment, Russia has no desire whatsoever to talk to anyone in the West, because their philosophy is, we're going to end the war on our terms. There's no negotiation. And when the war ends on our terms, we'll tell you what territory we're having. And that's the end of the discussion. Now, whether that transpires to be the case in the future remains to be seen, but that's the Russian perspective at the moment. The idea of negotiations have long since gone. I think the Kursk incursion was the final straw for them. And the West can argue to the contrary and say, we're not accepting these terms, but they gave some terms and said they're keeping the 4 republics, they're keeping Crimea, and, the Ukraine isn't part of NATO, it's neutral, etc., etc. That were the terms. They were ignored and they invaded Kursk, and then the Ukrainians did. And of course, then all bets were off as to what the negotiating point would be. But it appears now Russia's gone past the point of saying there's no negotiation. And I think the West is extremely fearful that that's now the Russian position. And if Russia then effectively is in a position to conclusively declare victory, because the idea is the West could say, well, we had a negotiation, so Russia didn't win the war. It was, and they'll try and sell it to the people. Well, if Russia says there's no negotiation, then a whole different set of parameters apply. And for the West, that is extremely damaging, because, given the whole stance all the way along was Russia will lose this war. So that's in essence where we are from a perspective of, the Russian perspective and what's going on. But there are other points, and we'll come to them shortly, which is perspectives coming out the West, and they're very, very telling, and it highlights a lot of the reason why the West completely underestimated Russia's capabilities. But I'll stop there, Ken, because then you can come in and, start your perspective, discussing your perspective on this.
Yeah, there's the Schultz wanting to speak to Putin and the Russian president not even deigning to give him any time. Really, to me, when you take a look at it, shows a much wider problem that the West has, and it's not just starting with Nord Stream and cheap energy and the sanctions and seeing the Western economies, especially Europe, just fall by the wayside because of their inability to recover from the energy that they got from Russia before the conflict. But there has been complete, almost across the board, political change that has occurred in the 2.5 years of this conflict. Sarnak has gone from the UK, and Starmer's in there now. Macron, for all intents and purposes, lost the election, and he's just using political maneuvering to hold on to whatever power in there. But the people have said, we've had enough, we want change. Austria just had an election where the right-wing anti-war movement has stepped in. Schultz is fighting against the AfD and others that don't want anything to do with the conflict and demand changes that the government has done and an improvement to the economy. So we're seeing that all across Europe. It's not just their economics, it's also their political structure. So those who remain in power now all of a sudden have to have something that they can take to their people and say, hey, we can create this peace plan. And something else in that has really just bit me in the butt of thinking about this. How dare Ukraine, the EU, NATO, or the United States have the audacity to claim that they are the ones who are going to bring a peace plan to a conflict that they helped create? There is no way in hell, especially after the deception of the Minsk agreement, that Russia would ever listen to the U.S. to NATO, to the EU, to Germany, to France, any of these coming with this peace plan. It was going to be either Putin and Zelensky come to and finally get a consensus of what they're going to do following the demands that Russia laid out at the very beginning, or it was going to be, we're going to get, as you mentioned earlier, we're going to take what we want, we're going to ensure this happens, and well, you guys now in the West are going to have to live with it. End of story.
Yeah, and that's basically, or appears to be, the Russian position. Now, what I think is very telling, because it's always timing in the West when statements come out. And it's very interesting, there were statements attributed to the US Deputy Secretary of State, Kurt Campbell, who said that Washington was very highly concerned about the rapid reconstitution of the Russian military. And he said that, it frankly surprised us, meaning the United States. And he further admitted that this has been a topic of real anxiety for the West, and that clearly the State Department underestimated this relationship they thought that existed between China and Russia. To what extent China supported Russia in the war is debatable, but I think they've certainly supported them financially and helped them with raw materials. I don't dispute that. But he also said there's recognition in the West that resolving the Ukraine conflict, and this ties in with what we've just been discussing, saying will require diplomatic engagement with Russia in the not too distant future. So meaning they think there's going to be some diplomatic engagement. On what level? Because Russia's made its position clear. This is not going to happen because, you know what? We don't trust you. We can reach an agreement and you'll renege on it, because that's all the United States does, and its vassal states who will refuse to stand up to the US and have a counter perspective on things. He also said the stakes are high for us because we can't accept outcomes that are suboptimal to the extent that China or Russia may come away from from Ukraine thinking we can replicate this somewhere else. This is what is very indicative of a problem in the West, and particularly the United States. They think that if Russia achieves its objectives, then China will think, well, we can get away with taking Taiwan, and in exactly the same manner. And they don't remotely think like this. But this is just this outdated thought process that completely misinterprets the situation from, be it the Russian perspective, the Chinese perspective. It also says that the statements that Moscow's stated goals, and this is what the West kind of admitting to now, include making Ukraine a neutral nation with caps on its military, the reversal of discriminatory policies against ethnic Russians, and the removal of radical Ukrainian nationalists from positions of authority, and also that Russia has demanded that Kiev relinquish its claims on sovereignty to the 5 formerly Ukrainian regions, meaning Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. Now, that's what they think the negotiating position is going to be. Well, it's not going to be that, because Russia's moved on from that. And if the United States thinks it's in a position to negotiate, it's in for a bit of a shock. Another point worth making is regards to the F-16s. They were supposed to be the next game changer. And now there's admissions coming out of the US that there are issues with them. And to put it bluntly, if we put them up against the Russia's warplanes, we can't defeat them. We simply lack the capability to actually challenge them, because they have obviously far greater aerial superiority. So that's a kind of just an incredible admission. But I think the US basically realized this, but they kind of got to the point where they went, well, we're just going to have to send them, and then some of the other NATO allies sent them. But in reality, we've heard nothing from them. Certain ones have already been destroyed. We know that to be the case. So that's another example of a game changer where rapidly there's an admission it's not a game changer. And the other thing is the rapid admission that Ukraine in Donetsk is, just to quote, buckling under superior firepower. So that includes that key strategic town of Pokrovsk. We mentioned that before. Obviously, Ugledar, which is now fully in the hands of the Russians. And the claims being, well, nothing's really been going on for 2.5 years there, and suddenly Russia is taking huge control of these areas. And because they're kind of using a different method of fighting with smaller teams, they're backed by superior quantities of artillery and drones. It's battlefield communications. And obviously, because Ukraine simply lacks everything, resources, and also obviously people just simply to fight wars, including combat units. And the speed with which Russia has made progress has completely shocked the West. They can't understand how this is possible. But again, it's this total miscalculation from day one. And really, when you think about it, how did anyone ever imagine that Russia could be defeated by Ukraine? Because, and I made this point from day one, when you look at when Russia first started all these strategic strikes in Ukraine, across all of Ukraine, and you looked at the targets they hit, you knew they could take anything out whenever they wanted. So the argument is, could they have ended the war a lot quicker? Yes, but they didn't fight a war. They fought a special military operation, and they're very different things. And the other question is, ultimately, if Russia's back was against the wall and they looked like they were going to be defeated, that's an existential threat. And then Russia would have resorted to nuclear weapons, in which case they would have then won the war. And that's the problem with this. There was never this understanding in the West that Russia ultimately couldn't be defeated because it's a nuclear power. And here we are today in a situation where everybody knows Ukraine's lost. It's very clear if you look at the body language of even Zelensky. Zelensky no longer wants to be the president in Russia, or in Ukraine. But he's got absolutely no choice but to continue for that to be the case, because that's the nature of the job he's in. It's sorry, but you're the president, so you're going to have to stick it out until the bitter end. But I think the fact NATO countries are clearly worried that Russia doesn't want negotiations, and it intends ensuring the world knows it's won, conclusively. That is a huge problem, because you're back to that point you made, Ken. Politically, what damage is this going to do to countries who are, shouting the odds about the war from day one? What's it going to do to those people in Brussels? What does it do to NATO? What does it do to the United States' standing in the world? So there comes a point when you want to cut your losses and go to the Russians, we want negotiations. And what's the Russian response going to be? We're not having negotiations. It's not happening. We're going to tell you what the outcome's going to be. This is going to have a devastating effect on all the nations involved, NATO countries, etc. And then, of course, even when the war's over and whatever the future of Ukraine is, and that's extremely difficult to say, because what happens to Western Ukraine is countries like Poland going to want a slice of West Ukraine. Well, the Hungarians, well, the Romanians, it remains to be seen. But even setting all that aside, what's going to happen in the future when Germany then thinks, oh, we can try and make friends with Russia. We want to be friends again. Let's forget the past. Oh, yeah, we were arming the Ukrainians, etc. Yeah, we wanted to crush you economically. What happens when they desperately need Russian energy? What happens when they desperately need Russian resources? And Russia says, no, you're not having them, which they are very likely to do so. The consequences and fallout for Western countries of this war could last for a very, very long time, and with huge damaging consequences for all the countries involved. Hence the friendly and unfriendly countries. The list exists. And you can no doubt that if Russia wants to be vindictive and spiteful, then they will fully enact those decisions to have nothing to do with unfriendly countries, of which there are huge and large amounts of them inside Europe. And obviously that includes the United States. So this is a point where, the argument is the West wants the war over, but it doesn't know how to end the war. It doesn't understand negotiations are not going to happen, and therefore, whilst they finally realized Russia's capabilities to fight the war, and the way they totally underestimated everything about Russia economically, financially, in terms of the leadership and the Russian people, they now got to face a whole new world of reality that they just can't accept, and that's going to be there won't be negotiation. We have to hope there is negotiations, because at the end of the day, that will end up having hopefully a better outcome for Ukraine itself. Because at the end of the day, right, there's huge amounts of Ukrainians who don't support the war. They want the war to end. They're very unhappy with all their relatives, friends, etc., and family members who've died as a result of this. So the idea of just that there's no outcome for Ukraine itself, it should be very concerning and very worrying, particularly if the Western nations decide they want a piece of Ukraine as a result of this. It could turn into a very, very ugly situation. But I think it was worth returning to the subject of Ukraine on the basis of where we are currently, and just to the realization that everyone knows Ukraine's lost. Now it's just a question of who wants to try and come out of this unscathed in the West. And I think they're going to struggle to do so.
Yeah, I think, we covered all of the stuff that's in the current purview of the conflict. But I think it's a good transition. We talked about, the European leaders and what their attempts and their responses right now are. But what about the U.S.? It was interesting to see when Zelensky did his great roadshow a week or two ago, going to Kamala, going to Blinken, and then even going to candidate Trump, former President Trump, and seeing what President Trump did to him. Pretty much it was like Zelensky was the boy who wanted the PlayStation, and instead, he's walking behind Trump in the pictures and the videos with a hangdog look, knowing that he was chastised and that he's going to get nothing. And so the question then becomes, right now it's likely, I'm going to put the estimates about a 70-30 chance that Trump wins the election. If that's the case, then here's the scenario. There is integral respect between Putin and Trump. The biggest problem with Trump during his first presidency was that he did not understand the whole system, and individuals like Bolton, Newland, Pompeo could run roughshod and scuttle some of the attempts he did to try to create partnerships and align, good deals with the leaders of the world. But, and I think even President Putin knows this, because during one of his interviews, he said that he likes and respects Donald Trump, but he realizes that it's not Donald Trump who's making many of the decisions that affect the geopolitical scheme. So the question then is going to be, are we going to have, when Trump is president, the same type of maneuvering happening with the three-letter agencies, the State Department, the Pentagon, et cetera, around him, going around his back? Or are we going to see an absolute change, which, if done, could potentially start anew some fresh relations between the West and Russia? And I think that's important to look at, especially when there was an interesting prank call that Pompeo got, and I was going ahead and swap it back over to you, because he laid out pretty much what the Atlanticists are suddenly wanting to do in regards to the switch over from Ukraine to now being friendly with Russia in order to achieve a different goal.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's quite amusing, because I've talked about it for a decade, that the plan was always because the two biggest fears for the United States was German-Russian rapprochement and integration, because it's the end of NATO and it's the rise of the broader Eurasia continent, but also even you could equally say they were very, very frightened to what they thought was to have Russia and China join hands. Well, Russia and China have long since joined hands. It's over a decade. They've been joined at the hip that long. The West just doesn't understand it. People have spent the last decade permanently arguing with me that this was never the case. Now they finally understand it's the case. And the idea is, and Pompeo's making a statement now, Pompeo's not in office. Okay, maybe in the future, in a Trump administration, that might be different. I don't believe his perspective is unique, but the idea is, well, we need to kind of find a way to make friends with Russia again, because we have to get Russia in the Western camp and prize them away from China. Well, the basic nuts and bolts of that conversation is it's never going to happen. So the United States can think whatever it likes. Whether that becomes a reality is irrelevant, because China and Russia know it anyway, and you know, they've discussed it. They fully know that that was a US intention, and if the US ever tried it again, if you talk about trust and relations, if Trump ever suggested it, I'm not saying he will do, but if he did, that's the end of US-Russian relations, full stop. So, and I think Trump knows this. So I think this is just him articulating, this Pompeo articulating a policy that still lingers in certain corridors of the Beltway. But, you know, I've known about it for over a decade, so, and known how ludicrous it is. So it's a non-starter, but it's certainly an indication of the fear that the United States has in that integration between Russia and China, which is self-evident and has long since been the case. But also, I guess, given the fallout of what is going to happen from the Ukraine war, it might not happen now, but maybe in a few years, there will be German integration into Eurasia with Russia. That you can't rule that out as a possibility. Things can change, not initially, but maybe in the years to come. So it's not surprising these kind of thought processes, you know, are still doing the rounds, but really it's just, it's one of those things in life you can say with absolute certainty it's never going to happen.
Yeah, I think when you take a look at it, Pompeo represents the dying breed of those in the Bush, you know, going back to the Bush lineage when they were president, and their thoughts on following the end of the Cold War, and this is how we're going to deal with geopolitical events and the hegemonic understanding of we control, you know, and this is et cetera, not realizing that the world changed in 2014. And, you know, as they say, the learners will inherit the earth, and the learned will find themselves living in a world that no longer exists. Anyway, Paul, want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
And obviously likewise.
And to everybody here, thank you for being a part of the Sirius Report community. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment, share this with anybody you think is be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.